So it's generally true that the stories and myths that give a nation or a people a sense of identity are not necessarily historically or factually accurate. We've talked about this a lot in our Sunday school in the chapel at 9 o'clock, that even the stories of Israel, when they came back from exile, they wanted to tell these stories that helped them get a sense of who they were. So they focused more on the truth and less on individual facts. Stories can be true and yet not factual. But at some point, it became necessary for us all to acknowledge that George Washington probably did not chop down a cherry tree and confess his guilt to his father, saying, "I cannot tell a lie." I know it comes as a shock to you. It broke my little tiny childhood heart that he did not do that, and he did not skip a silver dollar across the Potomac River. I tried, it's hard. But there is one of our national myths that is true factually and historically, and while we've distorted it, we've misremembered it, it still has a power to speak a truth about who we are as a people. The story of the first Thanksgiving has the ability to remind us why we give thanks. I've loved this story ever since I first heard it, though I can't say the Charlie Brown version was particularly accurate, though I love the part when Snoopy's making all the toast and the chairs keep folding up around the ping pong table. It's a classic. And yet, it taught me the truth I needed to know as a child. We give thanks. While schools and shows have simplified or exaggerated the story of the first Thanksgiving, the more you learn about what actually happened, the better the story becomes. My wife Courtney introduced me to Nathaniel Philbrook's book, Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community, and War, which is an extensively researched and well-written account of the remarkable saga of the Pilgrims and the beginnings of the Plymouth colony there. Courtney has actually read the book. I just hit the highlights, which she basically told me that I thought I would share with you. It's like the Cliff Notes version. It's like when you read the Cliff Notes in college and you still get an A on the test. I bet none of you have ever done that. I know I didn't. I did. The voyage itself took 65 days. There were 102 passengers on board, 2 dogs, and 25 crew or so. Now what's interesting is of the 102 passengers, only 41 of them were pilgrims. The rest were termed strangers. They were recruited from England to be warm bodies to fill out their numbers. I'm not sure how they felt sailing across the ocean being called strangers all the time. There'd be a lot of danger on that boat, but okay. Stranger danger. The 102 of them lived in between the deck and the hold, a crawl space not 5 feet high called the 'tween deck. They brought food, water, firewood, and beer, all of which was either gone or nearly gone before the voyage was over. 2 died during the voyage. Elizabeth Hopkins, one of 3 pregnant women on board, gave birth to a son on the boat. Unlike those who made an earlier attempt at settlement at Jamestown, they were not nobility or craftsmen or servants. The Pilgrims were families mostly, part of a congregation of English Puritan separatists who had settled in Leiden, Holland in 1608. They were upset with the Church of England. They wanted to reform it, but eventually said the best bet is just to start our own thing, so they went to Holland. And Holland afforded that freedom to separate and to do their own thing religiously, but it was a different culture. And when the children started to be more Dutch than English, they wore little wooden shoes and everything. 41 of the congregation of 400 decided to establish a new colony in the New World. Now, they had no illusions about the difficulty of the enterprise. At Jamestown in 1607, 70 of the first 109 settlers died during the first winter. The next year, 440 of 500 new colonists died of starvation and disease. By the time the Pilgrims set sail, 3,000 of the 3,600 English colonists at Jamestown had died. So not great odds there when you're going to the New World, and not much better than winning the Powerball a couple weeks ago. But they thought they were different. They fervently believed that God wanted them to do this and would provide for them. William Bradford wrote, "We verily believe and trust the Lord is with us and will graciously prosper our endeavor. It is not with us as with other men whom small things can discourage." He said they knew they were pilgrims. They sailed from Leiden to Southampton, met up with the Mayflower with more people on board, including William Bradford and Miles Standish, who was hired to handle all the military matters. They put in at Plymouth, and on September 6, 1620, headed across the Atlantic. They zoomed at an average of 2 miles per hour, encountered fierce storms, had to repair a broken mast. The deck leaked water constantly. The firewood ran out. On November 9th, 1620, they sighted land, explored the coast, and at that point did a most remarkable thing. They wrote and signed the Mayflower Compact to create a government based on civil consent rather than the divine decree. Now that was remarkable. They won't always live up to it. They said they wanted religious freedom, but it eventually became, as it often does, freedom for their religion, to do what it wanted at the expense of anyone who didn't agree with them. That's often what happens with things termed religious freedom. It's about the freedom for some to do what they want, while all the others suffered. But at that moment, with the best motives, they decided against a theocracy or divine right or religious prerogative. Government in this new colony would derive from consent of the governed and be carried out by elected officials. Eventually that changed a bit, but in those times they had these ideals. That's what ideals are. We don't always live up to them. We try to live into them. Sometimes we get it right. Sometimes we don't. On Saturday, November 11th, a small landing party explored Providence Harbor, but they all stayed on board on Sunday to worship and pray. On Monday, they stepped ashore, and the first thing the women did was find a pond and wash their clothes. Philbrick says it's the reason why Monday is wash day. So if you win a Jeopardy question based on that, the church gets 10%. That's a contract now. You've all agreed to it. They explored for a month, finally settled on Plymouth, started building the first of 19 small huts on December 23rd. Now, it snowed a lot on Thursday, right? Now, what month is this? It's November. So December 23rd in Massachusetts. It's already deep winter. Things aren't going to go well if they're just starting to build their houses. On December 25th, they began building their common house. Now, they didn't celebrate Christmas because the date in the celebration of Christmas was not in the Bible, so they didn't see it was important. 52 of the 102 that came would die that winter. But they still cleared and planted in the spring. On March 16th, Samoset walked into their village, beginning a long period of contact, exchange, and diplomatic relations with indigenous people of what is now called Massachusetts. Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag, sent him because he didn't trust Squanto. The Wampanoag did help the Pilgrims, and Squanto was helpful to the Pilgrims, though perhaps not for the reasons we typically think as children growing up. As far as we can tell, he was an opportunist who saw a chance to become invaluable to both the Pilgrims and Massasoit and play both ends against the middle. If he was sorted into a Hogwarts house, he'd be a Slytherin. That doesn't mean he was evil, just ambitious and opportunistic. Massasoit didn't trust him, but by Squanto telling Massasoit the Pilgrims had plague barrels, it was actually gunpowder, but he told him they had plague barrels stored, Squanto probably convinced Massasoit to ally with the Pilgrims instead of attacking them. So that was a good thing for the small, weakened, and desperate Pilgrims. William Bradford said, Squanto sought his own ends and played his own game. But the Pilgrims were grateful for his help nonetheless. Sometimes we have to be grateful for whatever help we can get, even if the motivation isn't always exactly pure. By September, they had a crop of corn, squash, beans, and peas, and most importantly, barley, which meant they could have their beer. The harbor was full of migrating birds, a good source of protein. So in early autumn, Bradford wrote, "They gathered the fruits of their labors. It is time to rejoice together after a more special manner." He sent 4 men fowling. They came back with enough geese and duck to feed everyone for a week. They planned a feast, perhaps reminiscent of the harvest festivals in England. In addition to the vegetables and geese and ducks, there was striped bass, bluefish, and cod. Their friend, at the moment at least, Massasoit, arrived with 100 Wampanoag people, bringing 5 freshly killed deer. Philbrick writes, "The first Thanksgiving marked the conclusion of a remarkable year. 11 months earlier, the Pilgrims had arrived at the tip of Cape Cod, fearful and uninformed. They had spent the next months alienating and angering every Native American they had come across. By all rights, none of the Pilgrims should have emerged from the first winter alive. That it worked out differently was a testament to their grit, resolve, and faith." Bradford said the feast was to, quote, "rejoice together after a more special manner." Part of their gratitude was for nature's dependable fertility and bounty. And part of their gratitude was that they were alive and not dead. Thanksgiving for the basic, elemental miracle of life. Sometimes it's easy to forget that this is why we give thanks. We woke up today. We're alive. We've made it this far. We have provisions, and we aren't alone. Throughout the Bible, God tells us not to fear and almost always follows it up with the promise, "For I am with you. I will be with you." It's what we celebrate in a couple of weeks, and he shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. It's like that famous affirmation in Psalm 23, "Though I walk through the darkest valley, I shall fear no evil, for God is with me. God's rod and God's staff, they comfort me." We are not alone. We are never alone because God is with us, and God has called us together as Christ's body. We have each other. This is why we give thanks. We are not alone. The fertility, productivity, and bounty of the earth is another basic biblical theme, especially in the Psalms. The Bible paints a picture of creation. It's a picture of abundance and bounty. God's creation is good, the Bible says on the very first page. Very good. Later Christian theology would come to emphasize the fallenness of creation, the sinfulness of humanity, the susceptibility of the flesh, human needs and appetites to indulgence. Theology started focusing on original sin rather than how we are made in God's image. We forget the goodness. We complain about the brokenness, but forget to give thanks for the goodness that we, each of us, are made in the wonderful image of God. The Bible begins with a celebration of earth's beauty and bounty, and the Bible promises abundance. There is enough. There is food for all. Human beings, on the other hand, have never been able to trust that and notoriously operate on the threat of scarcity. I was reading Verity, her nightly Bible story recently, and we read the story about God's gift of manna from heaven, but God's instruction to only gather enough for one day because there'd be more tomorrow. But the people just couldn't trust in the promise of abundance. They tried to gather more, but it would always spoil. As Verity said, the people weren't being very good listeners. Sometimes we aren't. Biblical scholar and professor Walter Brueggemann says, "We hardly notice our prosperity." Think about it. How often do we notice that we have toilets? Probably when we go somewhere that doesn't have them, some mission trip, some far-off place. Then we think, man, we're lucky. We don't notice it. That's prosperity for much of the world. We have running water. We have beds. We have houses that seem like mansions in 99% of the world, and I forget to be grateful. Do you know why? It's because I hardly notice my prosperity. It's hard to give thanks when you don't notice what you have to be thankful for. We operate on the threat of scarcity. That was Ebenezer Scrooge's problem in the beginning part of A Christmas Carol. He has that memory playing in his head of his father being taken to the debtor's prison. He's always afraid he won't have enough, and so he hurts other people to make sure he has enough. He holds it and saves it and hoards it, and it turns him cruel and mean. That's what happens when we operate out of a threat of scarcity rather than the promise of abundance. I think that's why the Pilgrims were able to rejoice together after a more special manner, because they were keenly aware of what they had, like their very lives, because so many had lost theirs. They had experienced starvation. Now they couldn't help but notice their prosperity, turkeys and ducks and deer and fish. But I think Brugman is right, we hardly notice our prosperity. When we forget the promise of abundance and operate out of scarcity, that's when we, like Scrooge, become greedy, stingy, and mean. That's why the ghosts came to Scrooge. They helped him to see all the good things. They helped him to see the abundance that surrounds him, not just in money, but in relationships, in joy. See, we become afraid and we try to secure our futures by getting all we can, getting everything. We keep the abundance for ourselves. We even pay people not to grow food while people starve to death. We may read the Bible about the abundance of the earth, but we keep our eye on the TV screen to see how the market's doing. In contrast, the Bible makes a radical promise with economic and political implications that there is enough. And furthermore, when prosperity is shared, when loaves are broken and passed around, miracles happen. The Bible proclaims that when prosperity is shared, abundance takes over. It's like the story of the boy with his lunch, a couple loaves of bread, a few fish, all these hungry people. He says, well, I got a sack of lunch. You can have it. It ain't much, but here it is. And you know what happens. Abundance takes over, so much so that 12 baskets are left over. The Bible proclaims that when prosperity is shared, abundance takes over. But do we believe that? And more importantly, do we live into that? And so the Thanksgiving challenge is to try to trust the promises of God, and that begins with noticing our prosperity and giving thanks for it. For we cannot share what we don't even notice we have. That's why I've been so excited about the Derry Facebook gratitude group. If you haven't been taking part, you can go on Facebook to the Derry page and you can see it posted at the top there. Each day there's a prompt that gets us thinking about something we are grateful for. Something that may easily slip our mind. Today's prompt is name a song or piece of music you are thankful for. We've had things like name an animal you are thankful for, a food, a friend. Because we often don't think to name those things we have in our lives that are good. It helps us acknowledge our prosperity, to count our blessings, as the old hymn goes. The Pilgrims were grateful, profoundly grateful that they were still alive. If we don't notice our prosperity, we probably don't notice that either. We're alive. We got up today. Life has been given again today. Stephen Mitchell introduces his translation of the Psalter with the observation that the Psalms of praise are expressions of a deep, exuberant gratitude for being here. I'm not sure I've heard it expressed more eloquently than the late Jane Kenyon, who died after a long battle with leukemia. She wrote a poem that says, I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. I ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe, flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. We ate dinner together at a table with silver candlesticks. I slept in a bed in a room with paintings on the walls and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. This is why we give thanks. Whatever you do in word or in deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, said Paul, admonishing this little community of Christians in the city of Colossae, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Never forgiving, to live in gratitude, to give thanks. Every day is Thanksgiving. Gratitude to God for the bounty of creation, for the gift of life, and for Jesus Christ, God's love given to us without condition, at the heart of our faith every day of the year. But so often it becomes a Sunday thing, doesn't it? We come on Sunday and we give thanks to God. But we kind of forget the other days of the week, because Monday comes, we got stuff to do, but Monday, God is with us. And Tuesday, God hears us. And Wednesday, God walks with us. And Thursday, God comforts us. And Friday, God proclaims again, my grace is for you. Saturday, God reminds us that God is with us in all things. And Sunday we remember. But every day, God's grace and God's gift and God's life and God's love is over us. But we often forget to give thanks. The late Robert McAfee Brown delivered an address once called Theology as an Act of Gratitude. He says the distinctive word in the Christian vocabulary is grace. That God is gracious to us, that God loves us no matter how unlovable we may be. God, as revealed in Jesus Christ, is a gracious God. And if grace is a distinctive word to describe God's attitude towards us, there's also a word that describes the response we are called to make. That word is gratitude. Grace and gratitude, always together. He said in that speech, there is one hymn that perfectly gathers up the theology of grace and gratitude. A hymn, he said, appropriate for every occasion. At the end of every sermon, at a baptism, a wedding, at communion. It's appropriate to sing before or after a meal. In fact, it was originally written to be sung as a table grace during the 30 Years' War. It is the hymn, Brown said, that I fervently hope will be sung at my funeral. It is a hymn that reminds us theologically, poetically, truthfully, that this is why we give thanks. So let us stand and sing that hymn together.